Hey everyone, this is Pete, and welcome back to Atari ST A to Z, a series of short playthroughs of Atari ST games, some which I grew up with and some which are new to me. Today is one of the latter, although I'm familiar with other versions of this game. Today we're looking at Xevious, which was a 1983 arcade game by Namco, ported to Atari ST by Probe in 1987, and then published by US Gold in Europe and Mindscape in the US. The programmer behind this port was Tim Moore, who was fairly prolific throughout the ST age and did a lot of stuff for Probe, so presumably he was an employee of Probe. His work included a few arcade conversions, including the Namco stablemate Metrocross and Solomon's Key, which is Tecmo, I think, if I remember rightly. And he was also the man behind the ST port of the unusual multi-load action-adventure Savage for Firebird. So, although Probe's output has been fairly variable over the course of the ST's lifetime, this guy was responsible for some of the company's better output. So yeah, we should be seeing at least acceptable things from this port of Xevious at the very least. I didn't know this port existed until quite recently, so I'm quite interested to see how well it plays. So let's go play Xevious.
Okay, here we are with Xevious for the Atari ST, copyright 1982 Namco, with a conversion by Probe. Now, if you're looking to try this version for yourself, one thing I will note is that the version that is on the automation menu discs has buggered up sound for some reason. So if you try that version and you're a little confused as to why the music sounds awful, yeah, try and track down a copy of the original disc instead, and it works much better. Anyway, off we go. Xevious. Xevious is, of course, an all-time classic and a defining game in the vertically scrolling shoot-'em-up genre. Whoops, and I'm dead already. As you can see, though, it came out quite a long time before this Atari ST version hit the scene. So, I mean, one could argue that it was a little bit dated at the time. I didn't even know this existed until recently, to be perfectly honest. But it doesn't surprise me. There were quite a few Atari ST versions of much older arcade games. Like, if you look back, there's stuff like Joust we've seen previously on this series. And Atari themselves put out... Whoops. Atari themselves put out a bunch of conversions of classic sort of golden age arcade games, like Moon Patrol and Asteroids and all that sort of thing. And the ST ports were very late. But the thing with all these games is that they have a certain timeless quality about them. I mean, people still play Xevious today and still enjoy Xevious today, so there's no reason why it shouldn't have come out a good few years after the original arcade version was current. And in fact, one could argue that there's actually a very good reason to release conversions of arcade games late back at that time. Because when the Xevious arcade game was current, the NES did a pretty good version of it. I can't remember when that version came out. But certainly if you look at the Atari 8-bit version that we've seen previously on this series, you'll see that the home computer hardware at the time wasn't really up to doing a particularly good conversion of Xevious. And so it wasn't until the 16-bit era that we really had home computing hardware that could do convincing arcade conversions. But of course, by that point, we then had arcade games that wouldn't really work on the 16-bit home computers of the period. Because by this point we would have been starting to get stuff like Outrun and Afterburner and stuff like that, and we've seen that while the 16-bit home computers certainly had a valiant effort at doing conversions of some of those games, it struggled quite a bit. If there was anything that involved sort of throwing big sprites around, or Sega's superscaler technology, or that sort of thing, yeah, the Atari ST in particular struggled. The Amiga generally did a pretty good job, because the Amiga had much better graphics handling capabilities in a lot of regards. It was much better at scrolling, it had more sprites to deal with, its sound chip was much better and all that sort of thing, but that doesn't mean you should write off the poor old Atari ST, as this series has hopefully made clear by this point. And as far as ports of Xevious go, this is actually a reasonably solid one. It certainly has the difficulty intact. It's a bit more sluggish than the original and the NES version, but it certainly looks pretty authentic to the arcade game. And you may recall a while back when we looked at the Atari ST version of Outrun, which was also the work of Probe. Now, I mentioned that Probe had a rather variable output on the Atari ST. And so Outrun is one of those games that people don't like very much, despite the fact that I don't think it's awful. I mean, it's not an amazing version of Outrun, as we said when we looked at that game, but it's not a terrible game in its own right. But it is still one of Probe's games that people don't like very much. This, on the other hand, is actually a pretty solid version of Xevious. And looking at the comments for this on Atari Mania, it sounds like there were a fair few people who were quite happy to see this. And also, as I say, Probe weren't like a universally bad company by any means. Their biggest sin was that they weren't terribly consistent. And I think that would tend to come down to who the individual programmers and designers were rather than the company themselves. Because if you look at the other stuff by the guy who did this port, stuff like Savage, those are all really solid as well. Savage is probably one of the more impressive Atari ST games out there, in terms of having giant sprites and huge giant sprites and smooth scrolling and very varied gameplay across its 3 different segments. I'll have to cover Savage at some point. If you ever listened to our episode of the Moe Gamer podcast where we talked about blood and gore, Savage is actually a game that used to terrify me. Not because it was a super gory game throughout, but in particular because in the 3rd stage of the game, you play as an eagle. And when that eagle got killed, he would bleed everywhere. And it really freaked me out for some reason. That's my enduring memory of Savage. Yeah, I guess my only real criticisms of this as a port of Xevious would be that it is a little bit sluggish. It could do with moving just slightly faster. And also the little background jingle isn't quite right. So in the original it was more like a constantly moving thing, whereas in this one's got a bit of sort of noticeable rhythm to it. Which isn't a bad thing. I mean, it still fulfills the purpose of that original jingle, and it's still just as annoying. It's just not quite right. And there's not really a technical reason why it shouldn't be right. Unless it was one of the common situations of the day, which is that someone was expected to pull out an arcade port without any reference material, which is entirely possible. And in fact, we've seen that a good few times on this series already. Jalico's Rodland was a great example, which is one of the reasons why it's all the more remarkable that game came out so well, because they had very little reference material to work with aside from a completely mangled sprite sheet that they had to make sense of themselves. And so I'm just wondering if this was a similar situation with this, where the developers had to put together this game based on maybe a few screenshots, photographs, perhaps some video footage, and they didn't quite hear the background music properly, and thus they did as close an approximation as they could muster using the Atari ST's hardware. But there's a lot of other things they got right about this, like that sort of tinkling glass sound when you shoot the airborne enemies is very authentic. That's one of the most sort of distinctive things about Xevious, I think, one that people often bring up when they're talking about some of the interesting things that this game does. The fact that the soundtrack for this game isn't all explosions and death and destruction, is that everything sort of shatters very delicately. Gives it a very distinctive feel. I will say one thing, this feels quite a bit harder than the NES version. I keep mentioning the NES version because it's very fresh in my mind, because I played it on the Evercade recently. And so I've got that as a very clear reference point in my mind at the minute. But yeah, it's got a lot of the mechanics intact, like the ground installations that don't shoot at you after they're a certain point down the screen. Keeps things fair. But also means that you need to be careful about prioritising your targets. And yeah, this is designed in such a way that you can sort of memorise the various waves, and you can practice and you can improve at it. You can get better at this game by just playing it over and over a few times. I got a much better score than last time, despite not having quite got as far. That's interesting. Yeah, very much sort of classic arcade risk versus reward going on here. You evidently get a few more points if you take a few more risks, but you also make life much more dangerous for yourself. Yeah, this is pretty good. I'm impressed. Good job, Probe. Does it have the big-ass mothership, though? That is the question. Not that that would be too hard to do, because, the mothership doesn't move or anything in Xevious. Oh, no! Don't know if we're going to get that far. I suspect not at this point. But let's just be careful. Let's just keep an eye on what's going on. Avoid the bullets. Take out the enemies we can. Prioritise targets. Not get too greedy. And we may make it yet. It's actually pretty forgiving on those bombs as well. You don't have to get a direct hit with the bombs in order to actually blow the things up. Oh no! Well, it is a little bit harsh on the collision detection on the ship, though. Right. One more go? One more go. Yeah, I'm pleasantly surprised with this. Because there's some good shoot-em-ups on the Atari ST, but there's also a lot of very bad shoot-em-ups on the Atari ST as well. Because it's one genre in particular where the platform's graphical weaknesses tended to be very apparent. It doesn't make the Atari ST versions bad in a lot of cases, but when you compare how the Atari ST version compared to the Amiga version, its nearest rival, sometimes it's absolutely no comparison. I think one of the best examples of that is probably Menace by Cyclops. The Amiga version of that is practically unrecognisable from the Atari ST version. There's so much more colour on screen, there's smoother scrolling. But in this case, as I say, it's a very authentic feeling port of Xevious. And Probe should be pleased with themselves for this, as they've done good. As I say, the only slightly lacking aspects of it are the slightly sluggish controls, but then the whole game is running slightly sluggishly, so it doesn't hurt the experience too much, but it would have just been nicer if it was just slightly quicker. And the other thing, as I say, is the music isn't quite right. But again, that's not the end of the world by any means. Oh no! I mean, that bit of music's fine, but the little jingle that's constantly going in the background, not quite right. But how much that bothers you depends on how much of a Xevious purist you are. And I am not a Xevious purist by any means. I don't even think I actually played Xevious back in the day, to my shame. It's a game I've become much more familiar with recently. But yeah, whoops. But yeah, I certainly never came across this version. Never came across the 8-bit version that we looked at previously. Didn't have an NES, so didn't come across the NES version. And didn't live anywhere near an arcade, so was unlikely to stumble across the arcade version, so the likelihood of me encountering Xevious in my early life was fairly slim. Which is a shame, because I would have enjoyed it back in the day, I'm sure. Nice thing about shoot-em-ups is that although they're very challenging by their very nature, they're also very easy to understand. So I've talked a fair bit on this series about how a lot of games I didn't really get back in the day because I was too young to really understand the intricacies of the mechanics. Shoot-em-ups was something that I really did get. I understood how shoot-em-ups worked, what you were supposed to do in them, and how they were fun. So yeah, I would have definitely got something out of this if I played it back in the day. But sadly, it was not to be, and now I have to enjoy it now. But at least I have a lot of options on places that I can play Xevious these days, which is nice. I can play it on the Evercade, I can play it here on the ST, I can play the 8-bit version if I really want to. Which I don't really think I want to anymore, but you know, it's alright. Or I can emulate the arcade version. I've probably got at least one version in a Namco collection somewhere that I can boot up at a moment's notice. So there you go. Anyway, that was Xevious for Atari ST converted by Probe. And they did a pretty damn good job on that, so well done to them. As always, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you again next time.